God gave Israel 10 opportunities to test him, to prove him, to see if he was trustworthy, to see if he was for them or against them. Yet, even when they had done so, they still believed he would forsake them and destroy them. They still refused to rest. Let's talk about it on the New Kosmos Videocast.
This is the New Kosmos Videocast. You've never heard it like this anywhere. Welcome.
And good day, good morning, good evening, good night to you wherever and whenever you're watching me. This is your brother and friend Maurice. What are we talking about? Well, we continue our series of studies on the theme, the new creation rest. Our topic is 5 times God's rest was rejected. 5 times God's rest was rejected. And this is the 7th video of this series. To see the previous videos, I will put the link to the series playlist on the top right of this video. Or you may visit the New Kosmos Videocast channel. Look in the playlist, The New Creation Rest. You will see this video and the rest of remaining videos. Before we jump into the study, if you find value in this content, please like, please share, and please subscribe. And if you want this channel to continue, consider becoming a member at patreon.com/newcosmos. There you'll find 4 membership tiers. If you choose the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th tiers, you can have access to my videos up to 2 weeks before they are released on YouTube. And you can download my books for free in PDF format. Additionally, the 3rd and 4th tiers give you access to the New Kosmos Masterclass. Now, last study we talked about trust in God's power and personality brings rest. Today we are going to talk about 5 times God's rest was rejected by Israel, that is. And so let's go to the Bible, John 14:27, reading from the English Standard Version. Jesus speaking here, since the words are in red, he said to his disciples, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." And another way you can say let not your hearts be troubled is let your hearts rest. The peace that God gives us helps us to rest from inside out. All right? So we rest spiritually, because you cannot rest physically, you cannot rest any other way unless your soul is at rest. So let's look at John 16 verse 33 for another example of what Jesus said concerning this. John 16 verse 33. John 16:33, look what he said to his disciples again. "I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace." Where? In me you may have peace. That is, you may rest. In the world you will have what? Tribulation or trouble, unrest, restlessness, anxiety, terror, fright, fear. But take heart, I have overcome the world. A little mentioned aspect of Jesus' teachings is that of peace during adversity. Notice what he says. In the world you will have what? Trouble. So this peace, this rest that God offers, and even that he offered through Christ to us, is not the absence of trouble. It's not the absence of adversity. It's not the absence of trial, but it is peace in the midst of tribulation. It is peace in the midst of adversity. It is to rest while the surrounding circumstances are chaotic. God offers us a rest which is most needed and most appreciated during adversity. But this rest, to rest in God and to rest in Christ, is not an instantaneous event necessarily, though it can be, since it is not achieved but received, right? But for many of us, we need to come into it gradually, okay? But it is possible for it to be instantaneous because it is something that is received. Remember, Israel was enslaved. They were crushed. They were hopeless. They 4 centuries in slavery. They cried out to God. God heard them. He sent Moses, a deliverer. Then he sent plagues. He opened the Red Sea. And by every measure, Israel had every reason to trust the God who rewrote reality for them. When God delivered his people out of Egypt, out of bondage, he didn't deliver them straight into the promised land. He delivered them into a wilderness, a wasteland, a neglected area, an abandoned area, no man's land, inhospitable, uncultivated, right? And yet God desired Israel to rest in that wasteland, in that neglected area, in that no man's land, in that uncultivated region. Why? Because remember, he told Moses, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. All right? So that rest was not only in times of abundance and comfort, but mostly in times of adversity and trial. That's when the rest is really needed. That's when it is really appreciated. God offers his rest to anyone who is willing to fully trust him. His rest manifests as a state of calmness that comes from being confident in his promises, confident in his power, and trusting in his personality, especially in the midst of adversity. So that rest is not achieved, it is received. God freed Israel from bondage through the process of raining 10 plagues upon Egypt. When they exited Egypt, they went into a wilderness, and their first encounter was the Red Sea. And so at this point, if we remember the narrative, the Pharaoh and his advisors decided that letting go the Israelites was a big mistake. Even though after their economy and their city was in shambles, their livestock was destroyed, their firstborn had died, but yet they thought it was a good idea to go and recapture the Israelite people. So let's pick it up in Exodus chapter 14. Exodus 14, and let's read verse 5. It says there, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, what is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh the king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. All right? So let's jump to verse 11. You can read the entire thing in your own leisure and pleasure, but for time's sake, we're going to skip this. So when the Israelite people saw the Egyptian army pursuing, they said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What's behind this question? It is an accusation. And that accusation is not so much against Moses, it is against God, because Moses was God's deliverer. Good. So the accusation really is a veiled accusation against God. What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Verse 12, is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. Could you believe that? Now, these are the same people who had cried out to God that they did not want to serve under the bondage of the Egyptians anymore. But now they are saying, Moses, you remember we told you in Egypt, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to be the Egyptian slaves than to die in the wilderness. All right? So the Pharaoh's army was approaching from behind. The Red Sea was obstructing their escape in front, and they had hills to the sides. So they were trapped between the rock and the hard place, so to speak. All right? And then the Israelite people began to voice what was in their heart, what was in their restless heart. In the midst of adversity, God had given them an opportunity to rest right there, based on the previous experience of how he had miraculously delivered them from the Egyptians just maybe a few hours or a few days before. 10 plagues. Egypt was in devastation. Now you had another scenario where the opportunity for God's power to be demonstrated on their behalf again, but they chose not to rest. They could have easily, and when I say easily, because I mean it's easy for me to sit here and judge, right? But most likely, if in that circumstance, I may have reacted just as they did. Okay? Because there's a thing about crowds as well, that everyone seems to pick up the same spirit and mindset of the crowd. So maybe I would have said the same thing with the crowd. But anyway, they could have made the switch, the fate switch, instantly in their mind. Now, that would not change the reality of what they were seeing, but it would change the reality of how they were feeling. So instead of choosing to flip the switch in the faith direction, to trust God and say, well, listen, God has brought us through 10 times with the Pharaoh. And we believe just as how he has exercised his power on our behalf, those 10 times, those 10 previous times, we believe he's going to exercise it again on our behalf. We don't know how he will do it, but we know he's going to do something. Rest begins in the mind that is placed and focused on God's promises, God's power, and God's personality. But they chose restlessness for 40 years. Let's read Psalm 78, beginning from verse 42. Psalm 78, where the psalmist talked about Israel's experience, that 40-year experience they had in the wilderness of restlessness. Listen to how he began here. By the way, we can go even to verse 41. They tested God again and again. When you test someone, you see exactly how they would react. Whenever there was a need that arose for the people of Israel, what happened? God provided the need. Okay, so they tested God, God came through. They tested God, God came through. They provoked the Holy One of Israel. Look at verse 42 now, because remember, this is like a synopsis. This is not going in a strictly chronological way. So this is like a synopsis. They, overall, over the 40 years, they did not remember. I would say they chose to forget his power. They did not remember the day when he redeemed them from the foe. So you notice, this is a mind problem. Okay? This is an exercise or a choice to focus the mind away from God's redemptive acts in your past or in their past. They did not remember. They chose not to remember. They ignored. When he performed his signs in Egypt and his marvels in the fields of Zoan. This is talking about when the plagues were poured out in Egypt. Okay? They forgot. They chose not to remember. He turned their rivers to blood so that they could not drink of their streams. That's the Egyptians could not drink of their streams. He sent among the Egyptians swarms of flies which devoured them and frogs which destroyed them. He gave the Egyptians crops to the destroying locusts and the fruit of their labor to the locusts. He destroyed the vines of Egypt with hail and their sycamores with frost. He gave the cattle of Egypt to the hail and the flocks of Egypt to thunderbolts. He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, distress, a company of destroying angels. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare the Egyptians from death, but he gave their lives over to the plague. He struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the fruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. Then he led out his people like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. Right? Now notice the imagery here that the Lord led out his people like sheep. He guided them in the wilderness like a flock. Right? He led them in safety so that they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. This is what Israel forgot. How could they forget? They couldn't. That's not something that you would forget easily. That's something that you choose not to remember, or you choose not to bring to mind, or you ignore. Rest is a personal and internal peace that is not based on fairy tales. It's not based on fables. It is based on concrete evidence. Is based on historical fact. And even if it is not based on your own personal experience, it is based on the lived experience of others. But it has been tested, it has been tried, it has been verified. And so when you place your confidence on that experience, whether your personal, as I said, or that of others who have tested, you experience a peace. You are at rest. And that peace, in the case of God's rest, it is contrary to the external chaos and calamity that may be occurring around you. God provided Israel tangible evidence to remember, to dwell upon, to encourage themselves with, that they may rest in times of adversity and trial. But they chose instead to dwell upon their distrust of God, that they were afraid that he would destroy them, that they were in terror of his power and his might. And for 40 years, they did this. That is why they were restless, and they taught their children to be restless. And so because of this, their experience with God was always one of unrest. And they eventually reaped the fulfillment of their own prophecy against themselves. Their prophecy of their own destruction came to pass not because it was God's will, but because it is the destiny of all men who refuse to be rescued. Let's read Numbers 14. Let's see what God said there. Numbers 14:21. Numbers 14:21. Look what the Lord said concerning that first generation that came out of Egypt, that God had displayed his power on their behalf, that he had made known his promise to, that he had displayed his trustworthiness to, but yet they refused to bring to mind all the times that he had delivered them, that he had saved them, that he had provided for them, that he had rescued them. He said, but truly, as I live, as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs. Notice, these people had seen his glory. They had seen his wonders that he did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times. They have tested God. They had tasted, so to speak, of the Lord and seen that he was good, and yet have not obeyed my voice. None of them shall see the land. Now, what does the land represent? The land represented rest. That land was a physical symbol of the spiritual rest that God had for his people. None of them shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despise me shall see it, but, meaning, except my servant Caleb, because he has what? A different spirit. Now, Caleb was an Israelite like all the rest of them. He was in the crowd. He was among the crowd. He and Joshua actually were the two that God mentioned, but only Caleb is mentioned here specifically. But there were two, Caleb and Joshua, right? These two men were in the crowd. They heard everything that was said. They heard all the people saying, well, it was better for us to stay in Egypt and die than to come out and be killed in the wilderness. They heard it all. But they said what? They had a different spirit. They had what? A different mindset. They chose to trust God's promise, his power, and his personality. They followed him fully. I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. Now let's look at what this same scenario here now, what we just read here, where God said, listen, those who came out of Egypt saw God's wonders, saw all his mighty acts on their behalf, yet still did not trust him. He says, look, these people will not enter the land. But look what Psalm 95 verse 10 said. Speaking of the exact same thing, look how Psalm 95 verse 10 put it. God speaking, the psalmist speaking of God said, for 40 years I loathed that generation. That generation is the one, that same first generation that came out of Egypt, saw the signs, saw the wonders, saw the mighty acts, saw how God moved in favor of Israel against Egypt. He says, that generation I loathe, and said, they are a people who go astray in their heart. Again, it's a mind problem. And they have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter where? My rest. Remember, in what we read there in Numbers, God said they will not enter the land. Now in Psalm 95 it says, they shall not enter my rest, because the land was a symbol of the rest, right? But because of that mindset, they could not enter because they were restless in their mind. They were restless in their spirit. But Joshua and Caleb had a different spirit. They had a spirit that rested, that they had a spirit that was at rest. Because why? They saw what God could do. They saw how God defeated the Egyptians, and so they were at rest. But the remainder, the majority, with all of that, still did not trust God. And so God gave Israel 10 times to try him, to test him out, to take him for a test drive, so to speak. And they deliberately forgot. They chose not to remember. They chose not to dwell upon. They chose not to encourage themselves with those 10 times that he demonstrated his power, promise, and personality in favor of them. And that resulted in them not being able to enter God's rest. Now remember what we just read in Numbers 14? Let's go back there. Numbers 14, right? I just want to point out something back there. Numbers 14 and verse 22. None of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times. All right? So Israel was given 10 times, as I said, to try God, to test him out. And those 10 times, they chose not to remember. They chose to ignore God's favor. They chose to ignore God's power exercised on their behalf. They chose to ignore it. Okay? And that resulted in them not being able to enter God's rest. Okay? Not necessarily the physical land. Yes, that was true. But they had not entered the rest even while they were in the wilderness. Because remember, that rest really is during adversity as well. They were to be at rest in the wilderness. They were to be at rest in adversity. And being at rest in adversity, being at rest in the wilderness, they would be able to enter the physical land rest. That's what, when you read what God said about Caleb here, that's what you get. At least that's what I get. Good? Because you notice it says Caleb had a different spirit, which means Caleb had a spirit which was already at rest. And therefore, it was destined to inherit the physical land rest. Good? So in this study, we're going to look at the first 5 of those 10 times that Israel tested God. And in the next study, we're going to look at the remaining 5, okay, because of time. So these are the first 5 times that God's rest was rejected by Israel, all right? And the first one is Exodus 5, verse 21. Exodus 5, verse 21. And as usual, we are just going to, summarize, because these are whole narratives and chapters that really I'm talking about. But for the sake of time, we can just summarize them, okay? Exodus 5:21. We're going to read from verse 20. It says there, they, that's the people, met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them as they came out from Pharaoh, and they said to them, the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Why was this accusation being leveled against Moses and Aaron? Because when Moses and Aaron went in to Pharaoh the first time, the Pharaoh responded. It says there in verse 18, go now and work. No straw will be given you, but you must still deliver the same number of bricks. The foreman of the people of Israel saw that they were in trouble when they said, you shall by no means reduce your number of bricks, your daily task each day. So they had to maintain the amount of bricks they were making, but they also had to provide the straw, which beforehand was supplied. So in other words, it doubled their work, because now they had to go and obtain straw to make the same number of bricks. Good? So now the people expressed their wrath against Aaron and Moses. Now, mind you, now, you see, when you read this just like in a vacuum, when you read this out of the historical context that what was happening, it seems kind of reasonable for them to say this. Good? But this was happening in the context of one chapter before, which is Exodus chapter 4. If you read Exodus chapter 4, or let us read verses 1 to 9 of Exodus chapter 4, and I will ask you if what the people said to Moses and Aaron here is reasonable. Good? It sounds reasonable now, but let us take into consideration one chapter before. So let's go one chapter over into Exodus 4 and begin at verse 9. Then Moses answered, behold, they will not believe me. That's Moses and the Lord having a conversation now, right? The Lord is sending Moses to the people of Israel to inform them of the mission that God is about to deliver them out of Egypt. But first, he would need to go through this process with Pharaoh. Good? Then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And the Lord said, throw it on the ground. So Moses threw it on the ground. It became what? A serpent. And Moses ran from it. Okay? So you notice, what is the Lord doing? The Lord is now giving Moses new information, and that new information now is to what? Renew his mind. It is to change his perspective on how he sees things, right? New information gives you new perspective, and new perspective renews your mind. Good. So now, but the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. Now, this is what the Lord said, that they, meaning Israel, now notice this, that Israel may believe, that Israel may what? Believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. So you notice, this wasn't done just to demonstrate some magic to Moses. It was done for a specific purpose, right? He was to perform these tasks in the sight of Israel that Israel would believe. Again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. And then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak. And when he took it out, and behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. So notice, these were signs that Moses was to perform in the sight of Israel, what? That they may believe. So Lord said, well, if they believe the first one, they're going to believe the second one. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So you see, God now is making a provision for the people, because he knew this is the first time they are encountering God in this way, and God is revealing himself to them, and knowing that, okay, they're very superstitious and so on and so forth, so they need some kind of signs and wonders to get them, get their faith up to that point where they will be willing to believe. So God gave Moses these signs to perform. And within these very signs, because remember they are in this Egyptian culture where you have Egyptian gods, and the serpents are very significant, and the Nile water is very significant, and leprosy is very significant to the Egyptian society and culture. And so God, in these three miracles, if you want to call them that, or these three signs, God is declaring to Israel, I am sovereign over everything that threatens you. You can trust me. You can rest. You have the staff turning to the serpent and back to the staff. God is saying, whatever terrifies you, I am in control. I am in command of it. The leprous hand restored, whatever diseases, whatever calamities, I am the healer. I have the cure. The Nile turned into blood. What sustains your oppressor? Because the Nile was like the power of Egypt. God said, I am in control of it. So God was not asking Israel for a leap of faith. He was giving them new knowledge to renew their minds and transform them into a new people. And that new knowledge was that the God of Israel rules over rulers. He rules over sickness. He rules over systems. Israel's bondage was neither final. Israel's bondage was not irreversible. The God of their fathers had come near with the authority to overturn their oppression. All right? So when the adversity came now, they were supposed to hearken back to these miracles, hearken back to these signs, and rest. But they denied the evidence. Now, we today in the 21st century, we are not much better. We are not much better because similarly, God could take us through the valley of the shadow of death 100 times. But the next time, we are still in anxiety. We are still in fear. We are still in doubt. Instead of saying, well, he'll do it again. There's a song that is very popular. It says, he'll do it again. If you just take a look at where you are now and where you have been, hasn't he always come through for you? He's the same now as then. You may not know how, you may not know when, but he'll do it again, right? That simple song basically outlines the principle of rest, okay, which Israel did not practice. Good? Anytime adversity came, they would accuse Moses and Israel, and by extension, by proxy, they are accusing God of bringing them into that situation to destroy them. Instead, they could have rested and said, Pharaoh has increased our burdens. Our God will surely make him regret this. Okay, so that's number one. When the first request was made to let the people go, the people rebelled against Moses instead of trusting the miracles that God had given Moses to show them. Number two, at the Red Sea, that's Exodus 14 verse 11. Exodus 14 verse 11. Let's read that. So you remember they were released by the Pharaoh, and on their way, on their journey, they came to the Red Sea, which blocked their path. So the people said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. And let's jump down to verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry land, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. All right? So they had very recently seen God deliver them with plagues. But instead of looking forward to an equally breathtaking defeat of the Egyptian army, they chose to accuse Moses and Aaron, and by extension God, of desiring their death at the first sign of danger. So that's the second time they rejected rest. The third time is at Marah. So one chapter over, Exodus 15, let's read verse 23. And when they came to Marah, that's on their journey, so they have crossed the Red Sea now. They have seen the entire Egyptian army drowned in the very sea that they crossed over on dry land. God closed back up the path, and the Egyptian army, which had followed them into that path in the midst of the Red Sea, the waters closed back over, drowned the entire army. They had just witnessed that. I don't know how much time had passed, but it could not have been more than a month. Okay? When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Man, come on. Come on. I mean, it cannot enter your mind. I say, Moses, the same God that just delivered us from the Egyptian army, the same God who turned the water of the Nile to blood, the same God that rained hailstones and sent insects to destroy the Egyptians, ask God to give us sweet water. No. Moses, what shall we drink? What shall we drink? Verse 25. And Moses cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them. So the Lord came through for them, and God made the bitter water sweet. Good? So that's the third time they tested the Lord. And they tested him and they saw he was good. Fourth time, Exodus 16, one chapter over, verse 3. And the people, okay, let's read from verse 1 to get the context. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of Israel came into the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. So this is the second month. Yeah, 1 month has passed, 30 days. And the whole congregation of Israel, of the people of Israel, grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. 30 days have passed. Good. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand," by who? The hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. You notice the accusation right there, okay? "Oh, we wish that we had died by the hand of the Lord." So you notice how they are ascribing their own destruction to God's hand. Okay, so God is willing to destroy us at any point in time. In the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. These people who had just seen Moses, under the inspiration and instruction of God, take a branch from a special tree, put it in the bitter water, and the water became sweet. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Couldn't you say, Moses, ask God, since God can make the water sweet, God can provide things for us to eat in this wilderness. After all, He is the one who is leading us through this journey to the promised land. No, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord. Oh, Moses, you have brought us into this wilderness to kill us with hunger. Okay? What did God do? The Lord said, "Moses, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them." Okay? God provided bread when the people were hungry. So that's the fourth time they tested God, and the fourth time they saw God was good. Number 5, at Rephidim. So that's Exodus 17, next chapter. Let's read verse 3. But the people thirsted there. All right, for the context, let's read from verse 1. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages according to the commandment of the Lord and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Okay, remember in Meribah, there was water, but it was bitter. Okay, now in Rephidim, there's no water, but just a few days ago, when there was nothing to eat, God provided manna. Okay. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" But as I read this and I looked at myself, and how I am tempted to react whenever I come into adversity, whenever I am faced with some sort of a trial or some sort of problem, I recognize in myself this kind of victim mentality, right? Oh God, why did you allow this to happen to me again? Blah, blah, blah. Why? Instead of going back, well, I usually have to force myself now to go back and say, "Lord, you got this. You got this. You brought me through this and that and the other and the next and all of that. And so I don't know how you're going to get me through this one, but you're going to get me through." Okay, I'm just trusting you to get me through, right? I have to actually force myself to rest, right? I have to say, "Lord, you knew this would happen, and so you have the solution already. So I just trust in you to put this under my feet." Okay? So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people?" Let's jump down to verse 7. And he called the name of the place Marah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" They actually began to say, "Well, the Lord is not among us," after coming through 10 plagues of Egypt, after coming through the destruction of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea, after coming through the bitter waters being made sweet, after coming through the manna being provided. Now here again, they have a problem with no water. The people say, "Well, the Lord has gone. The Lord has abandoned us." I mean, yes, it may seem quite ridiculous. It might seem frustrating, but I'm telling you, this way of thinking, it's in us, it's in you, it's in me. And we actually have to train ourselves to rest. And the only way we can rest is to trust in the promise, in the power, in the personality of God. We have to look back in our own life, in our own walk, in our own circumstance. And I hope there are events where we can see clearly that God has delivered us. I can look back and I say, boy, the Lord really has brought me through some terrible things where I really thought that was the end. And then we have to rest. We have to rest in these things. So anyway, so let's look at verse 6. "Behold," this is what the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." So God provided water there at Rephidim. So again, this is the 5th time the people tested God. God came through. God showed that he was a provider. He can be trusted. Good. So these are the 5 times. These are the 5 times, the first 5 times. The next study, we're going to look at the remaining 5 times. And in all of these 5 times that we looked at, these 5 times of adversity, God delivered, he provided, Israel overcame, they were refreshed, they were fed, and they still did not get it. But the biggest point I want us to get is that God's rest that he offered to Israel was not about the observance of a day of the week. It was about trusting in him. Not just the awesome and terrible God, but in the loving and covenant-keeping King. And so we will look at the remaining 5 times the people of Israel demonstrated their lack of trust in God's promise, power, and personality next time. And so we have come to the end of the 7th video in this series of the new creation rest. It was titled 5 times God's rest was rejected. And if you appreciate this content, please like, please share, and please subscribe. If you wish to support the ministry according to Galatians 6:6, you may give or become a member at patreon.com/New Kosmos. Until next time, I'm your friend Murray saying, may God richly bless you.
This has been the New Kosmos Videocast. Remember to comment, like, subscribe, and share.